Now that we've set the stage, you should have an understanding of how today's Republican Party was built on the foundation that I talked about and that was established in the First Republic. You have a better understanding of what Republicans mean when they say they want to make America great again and return to an era where America was good. But that's just the beginning of the story. In part 2 of this conversation, I'm going to talk through how the lessons from the Confederacy and Operation Paperclip all led to the creation of the Powell Memo. And the Powell Memo is the foundation for everything that we see today. That single document establishes the rules of engagement that the Republican Party has been using since the Nixon administration. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to this channel. In part 1 of this conversation, I went over how the Callais decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act wasn't something that happened out of the blue. In fact, it was one page in a long chapter in a massive book about how conservatives in the U.S. have been consistently against civil rights for anybody that isn't a rich white male. If you haven't checked out part 1, make sure you do that. And in this conversation, we're actually going to talk through about how one single document, the Powell Memo, set the stage and offered the playbook for the Republican Party to completely take over massive segments of the society so that they could push forward their vision of what it took to make America great again. Because you see, conservatives throughout the history of the U.S. were the old order. They were the elites. And many thought that at the end of the Civil War, they were defeated. But here's the thing. That old order never accepted defeat. It went underground. It went into the courts. It went into the state legislatures. It went into corporate boardrooms. It went into think tanks. It went into law schools. And the great-grandchildren of that old order are occupying the Supreme Court today. They're completely entrenched within today's Republican Party. And they either hold gavels or wear robes, but they all push forward this idea that we need to return back to originalist principles and pretend that those originalist principles, those principles that said that most humans are property, that's what we need to return to, and that's what neutral looks like. We're going to be covering a lot of ground in this conversation. Make sure you drop me a subscribe, so that way you don't miss any of the new episodes that come out. When we look at the 250-year arc of U.S. history, the fact that the traitors of the Confederacy were never punished for what they did and never held accountable for their actions is one of the biggest contributing factors to why we're here today. When you look at those decisions, America has followed this pattern of behavior where people that need to be punished severely never received their just desserts. Think about what happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II. What did the U.S. decide to do with all of the high-ranking Nazis that were now finding themselves in a situation where they had lost the war? Rather than ruthlessly punish those people and execute the vast majority of them, what did the U.S. do? The U.S. signed away any risk of retribution and brought them inside our shores, and those people began the infiltration of all sorts of different agencies and organizations within the country. We made the decision that rather than holding these people accountable for their decisions, it made more sense for us to assimilate them into our society and give them a free pass. There's certainly an argument to be made that what happened in 1930s and 1940s Germany is the direct outcome of the U.S. not punishing the Confederacy. And the argument can also be made that what you see in today's Republican Party, up and down their right-wing media ecosystem, and throughout their legislative ecosystem, and throughout their governing worldview, that wouldn't have been formed to the extent that it is today if the 1930s and 40s era Nazis that we welcomed here. If we want to take a look at how we got here, we need to understand a couple of things. The U.S. has consistently demonstrated an unwillingness to punish people appropriately for their treason. It happened with the Confederacy. The U.S. decided that white comfort was more important than accountability, It happened again in the aftermath of World War II, where the U.S. welcomed with open arms all sorts of high-ranking Nazi officials as part of Operation Paperclip. You can take a look at both of those things and draw a straight line to where we are today. But in between those time periods, we need to look at key people that were put into place and the ideas that they pushed forward and how those helped frame the situation that we are in today. And one of the key architects of how we got here is Lewis Powell. Because if you want to understand how we got here, you have to understand the modern Republican project wasn't built by accident. It was built and planned by Lewis Powell, and it was accelerated by Richard Nixon. In 1971, before he joined the Supreme Court, Lewis Powell wrote a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And before we dig into the details of it, if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Drop me a comment on what you found the most interesting so far. So what was that 1971 memo about? The title of the memo was called The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System. And the memo reads like a panic attack from the corporate ruling class. Let's understand who Lewis Powell is. Now, he's often described as a moderate Democrat of that era. But make no mistake about it, Lewis Powell was no friend of the civil rights movement. In fact, when you look at some of his writings that have been uncovered recently, what you start to discover is that this is a wildly racist justice who has a vested interest in keeping an all-white ruling class. So that is the frame of reference that you need to apply when you're thinking about the Powell Memo. So he looked around the country in the early 70s and saw the civil rights movement, consumer protection, environmental rules, labor power, anti-war organizing, and students questioning authority, and saw all of that and came to the conclusion that this was an attack on business. He stated that business interests in the U.S. were under attack. And that language matters, because once you define acts of democracy as an attack, you give yourself permission to do whatever you want to do to repel that attack. Let's keep in mind that language of attack and enemies is used by the Republican Party and has been used by the Republican Party for the last 50 years. What Powell did is that he identified universities, media, churches, intellectuals, artists, and politicians all as sources of criticism against the business interests in the U.S. So what's the TLDR of what he's saying? The TLDR of what he's saying is know your place and shut up. He did not like the fact that people of all races, creeds, and colors were speaking truth to power. That was the attack on the U.S. That was the attack on business. Students were talking too much. Workers were talking too much. Black people were talking too much. Consumers were talking too much. Everybody who wasn't already sitting in a boardroom getting a voice was a problem for Powell. And furthermore, corporate America, which propped up that architecture, which propped up that foundation that allowed for mediocre white men to prosper and everybody else to suffer, corporate America hated that too. So Powell gave them a plan. He said businesses need organization and they need long-range planning. And you need to be consistent over the years. You need large-scale financing and you need united political action. What Powell was handing them wasn't a memo. It was a battle plan. And the target was not just the left. The target was any institution that could teach ordinary people to question concentrated wealth. So every one of those entities that he mentioned, that was a target. So now that you know the details of the Powell Memo, we all understand how this is the foundation that everything going forward in terms of the Republican Party was built upon. What Powell did was give Republicans the playbook that they could use to execute and consolidate power for themselves and their rich benefactors. In the next part of this conversation, you're going to see how the memo was just a starting point. And in fact, the contents of that memo were left largely hidden as Powell was nominated to the Supreme Court. And that set the stage for everything that we see today. Powell's appointment to the Supreme Court would lead to catastrophic consequences for the average American. And that's what we're going to cover in part 3 of the conversation. So if you haven't checked out part 1, make sure you do that. If you like the conversation so far, drop me a comment. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and then tune in for part 3 coming up, where I talk through how Powell's appointment to the Supreme Court has largely been responsible for a lot of the judicial decisioning that you're seeing today, and how that's had a direct impact on the civil rights movement.